your eyes are open to the level of scrutiny and particularly of your life and everything you say. Every time somebody in the BBC misbehaves, people will be calling for your resignation, whether it's misbehaviour that happens well outside of the sort of jurisdiction of the BBC. You're ready to take on board that sort of challenge?
Well, I'm aware of it, because obviously I've seen what's happened to my predecessors and how the media and others cover the BBC, so I'm expecting that to take place, and I hope that I have the ability to deal with that.
So in your questionnaire, you said every now and then the BBC runs into a storm of criticism. And of course, just this weekend, you had an early taste of what that might look like when Gary Lineker signed a letter criticising the government's refugee policy. We're going to talk a lot more about impartiality and social media when some of my colleagues speak to you later. But do you think Gary Lineker's broken the BBC's new social media guidelines or not?
Well, let me say, I don't think it was very helpful. I don't think it's very helpful either for Gary Lineker or for the BBC or indeed for the cause which he supports, because what happens, as we've seen, is that it becomes a story of the BBC and Gary Lineker, another turn of that particular wheel. So I don't think that's terribly helpful. The context is that John Hardy created a new set of social media rules to govern the behaviour of the social media behaviour of non-news presenters. If I could just clear up, I think a slight misunderstanding. The John Hardy rules, remember the BBC has to balance freedom of expression, the right to have your opinion, and people have a right to say what they feel and believe, and especially if there are things that you don't agree with. I think the point about freedom of expression is that it should be allowed to do so. The social media rules in some ways loosened it. It allowed news presenters, it's very clear, you cannot, but non-news presenters are free to express their opinions. But there are some guidance, and that's to do with the manner, the civility of it, and the way, and not to make ad hominem attacks. So, as far as I'm aware, the signing of the letter did not breach those guidelines. I do think, however, the more recent tweet that Mr. Lineker, in which he identified some two politicians, does, on the face of it, seem to breach those particular guidelines of public. I'm not sure how egregious it is, but it does. And I would imagine that the BBC is now looking into that and considering its response.
And as chair, what would be your advice to the BBC on how it moves forward with that?
As a chair, I think it's our duty to monitor and see how well guidelines are delivering their purpose. And I think what I would invite the Director General to do is to say, having gone through this particular thing, what his view is about whether or not the social media guidelines as they currently stand are delivering what they intended to do, and I would interrogate that quite forcibly.
Okay.
Because I do think we need to find a solution to this, because it doesn't help anyone, and it does damage the reputation of the BBC if they're constantly in this round of not just this particular presenter, but generally, the BBC's reputation matters, and this isn't helpful. So we do need to find a solution to it, and I'd be keen, were I to be chair, to try and bring about such a solution.
To follow up on one thing that the chair, what appears to be the eternal BBC problem with Gary Lineker,
yes.
In that he provoked a crisis. That crisis provoked a whole new set of guidelines with an outsider coming in to set those guidelines. At the first opportunity, he, according to you, has broken, you think, those guidelines.
Not quite the first, the third opportunity. I think the initial two posts were considered, as far as I'm aware, I understand the BBC, they did not breach that. But I think this last one, the one that identified specifically two politicians, seems to me, on the face of it, a breach of those guidelines. And I imagine the BBC is looking into that now.
It just feels completely extraordinary that, this committee, but public discourse generally, is spending so much time worrying about the political views of a sports presenter. It is faintly absurd. Do you not think that at the root of it is that Gary Lineker has no regard for the BBC at all? It is the institution that has made him a successful broadcaster, and he is putting two fingers up to any guidelines that the BBC proposes to introduce.
I do understand the point you're making, but I think where I'd be chair, first of all, think in terms of whether we've got the balance right between freedom of expression, and the BBC is in favour of freedom of expression, as it should be, but also the duty to be impartial. Now, it's very clear when it comes to news and current affairs, and when it's not. But there is this grey area within which Mr. Lineker sits, and I share your frustration. I think I would certainly invite the Director General and his team to find a solution to this, because really we need to find a solution to this.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
The BBC itself has identified these sort of, I think it's 12 flagship programmes where the presenters have to have sort of special attention to how they behave on the social media world. You know, so I mean, there's the BBC has already laid out some,
yes,
quite interesting guidelines that need to be followed. Do you have confidence that they will?
Well, I think again, were I to be chair, I think it's a perfectly proper thing for the board to ask the executive whether these new guidelines have achieved the intention for which they were written, and to scrutinise fairly carefully and rigorously the answer to that question. And it may well be that they may need to review it again, but from the board's point of view, the BBC faced an issue about this. They've come up with social media, and they've spent some time discussing it. Now it's right and proper, given, as Ms. Green, Right Honourable Damon Green has said, that it seems to be tested once again, and I'd be keen to hear whether the media guidelines that's currently drawn up are standing up to that test, or whether they need to be examined again.
Okay, Steve.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for coming, Dr. Scott. Nice to see
Not
you.
at all.
I wasn't going to pick up on this, but it's just, you've said twice the exact same words. I'd imagine the BBC is looking into it now.
Yeah.
Do you know that the BBC is looking into it now, or are you just imagining?
I'm imagining. I haven't been formally told.
Have you had any conversations with anyone on the board about this?
Not on the board, no. I have, in preparation for this, I've been discussing both the DCMS and the BBC about these issues, and they've been careful, I have to say, to be guarded about what exactly they're doing, and I think that's fair enough. I don't have a locus here. They don't have.
But what do you think should happen? Because this is about you, isn't it? And it's about your character, and it's about who you are and what you think. I mean, what do you think actually should happen? Because last time Gary Lineker and the Director General went head to head, the Director General folded quicker than a deck chair on Brighton Beach. There was a complete and utter mutiny, and Match of the Day was cancelled, and commentators hung up their microphones. So, in reality, it's sort of Gary Lineker 1, Director General 0, isn't it?
Well, I can absolutely understand that. I suppose, what do I think should happen? As I've already said, I think on the face of it, the most recent tweets seem to be in breach of those guidelines. So what I think the Director General and the BBC who are overseeing this should determine whether that is or that is not the case. If, as I suspect they may do, they say it is the case, then they need to think about what is the condign action to take. And that is really,
while keeping football coverage on the air.
While keeping football coverage on the air.
We seem to have a football martyr. Anyway, fascinating as that is.